Hello, Brigham McCown, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute and Director of the Initiative on American Energy Security. Joining me today is author Paul Tice, who spent 40 years working on Wall Street, is the author of a new book, The Race to Zero. Feel free to talk about that and where folks can get it. I highly recommend it. And what I found really interesting about it is it's called The Race to Zero, how ESG investing will crater the global financial system. Paul, thanks for joining me today.
Good to be with you.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit in general first about ESG and then really dive into how it is affecting the energy markets. But for anybody who maybe doesn't know, how do you define ESG?
So ESG stands for environmental, social governance, and these are factors that, as the argument goes, should be used to drive your company policy and your investment portfolio decision-making. They are non-financial factors. They are highly subjective, particularly at a moral level. And, it's meant to displace the financial approach that we've used up until now. And it's all part of the theory of stakeholder capitalism, which says that your company needs to be run not for the good of the owners and capital providers and your employees, but for the good of society, for people and planet, as they like to say. And honestly, that's not capitalism. That is closer to fascism.
Well, and when I hear that, I think we, from a traditionally conservative approach, we have a duty to help out our neighbor, our fellow man, person, if you will. But companies, especially for-profit companies, are in business to make money, and they do that by selling a good or a service that people want to purchase. So it's a consumer-driven economy for which companies adapt and they do real well. They provide products Americans don't want, they go out of business. Isn't that sort of the traditional underpinning of a free market economy and a capitalist system?
Yeah, I think the business world, certainly the finance industry that funds a lot of business growth, are already contributing a lot to society, right? As you mentioned, that companies employ people, they pay them, from that after-tax income, they could donate to charity. Companies, provide business to suppliers. They provide a good or a service that the market demands. Again, all of them are already operating within the regulatory boundaries, particularly when it comes to environmental regulations, objective environmental regulations. And then again, Wall Street has been financing growth of new technologies, third world development, for decades. So I think they're both moral universes to begin with. The problem with ESG is, again, it's morally subjective. And a lot of the progressive goals that have been rebranded as ESG objectives really are not going to benefit society. And as the subtitle of the book kind of indicates, it's actually going to be very negative for society if ESG succeeds in defunding the oil and gas industry because of this focus on climate change.
So why are they doing this then? What's the underlying rationale here?
I think it's all about political control, right? This is basically the government working through third-party activists led by the United Nations to control all the capital in the financial markets and to control companies, right? So it's all about political control and economic freedom. And again, if they succeed on the climate change front and they can defund fossil fuels, it'll restrict, basically every American's economic choices. It'll lower living standards, your mobility, your ability to choose in terms of what to buy in the way of a car. Really, every consumer purchase can have an emissions aspect to it. So the government can basically be part of every aspect of your economic life. And you're already seeing the beginnings of that. And I think Europe is a good, warning sign to us because they're very aggressive on a lot of these fronts. And they're going to give us an indication of how badly this is going to go over the next few years.
Well, what we have seen, right, with the Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and the subsequent withdrawal of a lot of Russian oil and gas from the European economy, was a catastrophe for Europe, right? Germany has seen deindustrialization, the inability to keep heavy manufacturing going, price escalation. Why do you think there's not a different answer after people have seen what happens when you remove prematurely fossil fuels from an economy?
Yeah, it's interesting the European response because many politicians and activists over there said that the proper response to what happened around the Russian invasion of Ukraine was to move more aggressively to renewables, right? Be almost fully dependent on wind and solar, right? Which is crazy, obviously, because it'll weaken the European economy, and then you can't really project either military or political strength. Um, so, I think the other side, again, if you're focused on control, you want to focus on fossil fuels because that has driven capitalism and economic freedom for the last 200 years. So there is a rhyme and a reason to why they are so obsessively focused on getting to net zero and decarbonizing. They know it's going to lead to deindustrialization, as you said. In Germany, you can just see that over the last few years. And over the last 2 years, we've lost a lot of 100-year-old industrial companies in Germany. And no one talks about Germany as being the engine of growth in Europe anymore.
Yeah.
And a lot of politicians are okay with that. So, I think we need to keep that in mind in terms of coming up with tactics to reverse this. But, I think that logic doesn't work on the other side because it's all about getting control.
Okay. One of the things I found interesting, pardon me, is that if we look at the cost factors that go into manufacturing or most companies, you have the cost of raw materials, you have the cost of human capital, and then energy, right? That's one of the major components that goes into making stuff. And with cheap energy prices, we've seen reindustrialization of parts of the USA, especially up in the Marcellus Shale, eastern Ohio, western Pennsylvania. We've seen where being a energy independent or largely independent has been a success for the economy, a success for our energy security. So why is this controversial? Why are people not agreeing that abundant, affordable, reliable energy is a good thing?
It's a logical argument, and as I've been saying, and I talk about in the book, I don't think reason will work on the other side, but everything you say is true. And I think the Republicans, and again, this is a political issue when you talk about ESG. It's basically progressive politics masquerading as finance. So I think we need to acknowledge that and basically talk out loud about how we're going to find a political solution to this. So I think Republicans need to be more comfortable talking about this openly, including around climate change and the argument that's being made there and the problems with the data, which more scientists are feeling more comfortable to come out with about it. But I think the other side fully understands, and we're talking Democrats in this country, liberals in other countries. They fully understand all the benefits of fossil fuels, the need to be energy independent from a national security perspective, from a military perspective. And if you look at the US over the last 20 years, I think one of the most amazing technological advancements hasn't been the internet or iPhone and putting everything on your phone. I think it's shale technology,
Yeah.
which has changed this country from, a country dependent on foreign imports to one that now can export both gas and oil, right? And we've just changed the reserve life picture for this country. We were running out of oil and gas 20 years ago, and now that's being completely reversed. But you have politicians on the Democratic side of the aisle, they're trying to shut that down. They're trying to shut it down at the state level, like in Pennsylvania and Colorado, and they're trying to do it at the federal level where they don't have control over the Gulf Coast and Oklahoma. So again, this is a political issue. We need to acknowledge that why they're doing it.
Okay. Yeah, what I find interesting is, if we go back to World War I and World War II, America was not only the arsenal of democracy for guns and butter, but we were also the energy storehouse for the Allied war effort. Close to 80% of the oil and petrochemicals, aviation gas, all came from America. And then we suddenly, for some reason, we forgot about that. And, in through the 70s, became dependent on the Middle East for oil. We saw the Arab oil embargo just a little over 50 years ago. And every successive president, whether they were Democrats or Republicans, talked about this need to become energy independent. And we got there pretty much, as you point out, thanks to the shale plays, the hydraulic fracturing, horizontal directional drilling, some other innovations. And then why, I guess where I am struggling with is how do you talk to people to say, look, you don't want to give this up. You don't want to go back to energy poverty from energy abundance. Energy makes our way of life possible. It provides us with all the things that we need. Um, why does this not resonate?
It's a great source of freedom, economic freedom, right? Raising living standards. And, if you're working in government, then you have less control over the entire population. And there's obviously more mobility and freedom in America than there is, say, in Europe. So again, I think this is a politically driven movement. We need to acknowledge it. And, I think the climate change argument has been the most elegant so far used against fossil fuels because, it has changed over the last 100 years. In the middle part of the 20th century, everyone was complaining that we were dependent on foreign oil, as you mentioned. And then, as soon as we become not dependent anymore, then the argument has already changed to, well, we can't have emissions and we need to reduce our emissions in this country, even though they're growing in China and India, because it's an equity issue. So the whole
Ah,
climate change argument has also been wrapped up with this whole justice issue embedded in the ESG program. So again, it's all progressive wants, and you have to buy into all of them. Otherwise, you're singled out as a target if you want to speak out about it.
okay. It's interesting you talk about developing countries and targets because obviously, if we look, one of the things I always mention in Europe is that the United States has reduced GHG emissions uh, more than any other grouping. I include EU as a single grouping. Meanwhile, China's emissions look like a rocket launch into space, right? And they're not constrained by the Paris Climate Change Agreement, and their emissions total more than the rest of the Western world combined. Why are people talking about that?
Yeah, they should be. And actually, I'll throw out another statistic. For every 1 gigawatt of coal power generation capacity that we've shut down in North America and the EU since 2015, when they signed the Paris Agreement, 2 gigawatts of new coal generation capacity has been added in the third world. And as you say, most of that's been in China and India. So there clearly is a two-tiered playing field here where the third world, which includes China and India, which we can have a debate about whether they're still developing countries, certainly in terms of the size of their economy, they're not. They're held to a different standard, which is no standard, but Europe and North America have to do all the heavy lifting. And the end result will be if you take away fossil fuels, which is the driver of manufacturing and industrialization, you will have lower living standards, you will have less economic growth, people will be poorer. And if your electricity grids are dependent on wind and solar, which are intermittent, then you're going to have power outages. We're going to have problems in this country we haven't had to deal with for 100 years in terms of bad weather leading to a loss of electricity and people dying in the cold.
Okay. Well, are we placing ourselves? I think I know the answer to this, but I want to throw it out to you. It seems like we are placing ourselves voluntarily at an economic and security disadvantage to other countries such as China, right? If you're competing on the international stage for finished goods, products, services, pretty much anything, you have to be competitive. And if our electric costs through regulation, through mandatory electrification are going up, yet there is no such standard in other countries. I'll keep using China and India as examples. Isn't that akin to kind of tying our hands behind our back, tying our feet, and jumping into the deep end of the pool?
Basically, it's crazy. And most rational people say you shouldn't do this. And certainly, if there was any concept of sovereign integrity, you would not be doing this. But all of the liberal Western democracies have bought into this, since 2015. Well, over the last several decades, but it's been particularly acute since 2015 when we passed the Paris Agreement and we passed the Sustainable Development Goals, and ESG has really kicked in force. So it's irrational. It's going to be negative for everyone living in the developed world. And, maybe it'll create a more level playing field, but there has to be an easier way to raise living standards in the third world without lowering them in the industrialized world. And if you actually think through it, if we kill consumption in Europe and North America, who is going to buy all the natural resources and goods and services being sold by these developing countries, right? So that's part of the subtitle of the book. It's going to be negative for the financial markets because the macroeconomic picture is going to be pretty bad.
Do you see any scenario where developing countries, countries that want to be more like us, people that want to lift themselves out of poverty, are going to suddenly say, "Oh, okay, we don't need coal, we don't need gas. We'll just take a bunch of solar, please."
No, no one ever said that ever. If they're in a developing country or should, right? And I know there's been a movement to push renewable wind and solar on countries in Africa. It's not a reliable source of energy. It's not going to help development. So in the most case, it's on the margin. I mean, China is held out there as this big investor in electric vehicles and solar. But again, it's on the margin if you look at all of the coal generation that they have. So I think it's more window dressing, and the same for most developing countries. I think they get the joke that fossil fuels, you have to have that to drive economic growth. And they're not going to fire coal workers because they're worried about the emissions from that sector, right? Only in this country. You mentioned that emissions are down in the US. They're down mainly because we've shut down coal since 2007, which is not a great look for either the country or the energy industry, where oil and gas companies were looking the other way when the regulators were going after coal, right? So that's unfortunate, but I think we should acknowledge the fact that's not going to work on developing countries. So we have this movement here led by companies like EQT Corporation, which works up in the Marcellus and is trying to promote US LNG, right, which is all to the good. But they're making the argument that we should displace coal in the third world by using American gas and then shipping it over as LNG. I mean, no one on the other side of that trade is ever going to do that trade, right? Because they're not going to fire coal workers in Indonesia to use American LNG, right? So we have lost these political factors here in our decision making, but they're fully well aware of it in the third world.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, is that too, aren't countries in the third world going to use the cheapest form of energy they can get their hands on? And buying, even if they could, buying US LNG and shipping it halfway around the world is probably not as cheap as mining local coal, right?
No, or developing gas. I mean, there were a lot of dysfunctions in South America and obviously in South Asia where they're sitting on the reserves. They have been stranded up until now, but clearly they're economic, but they're just political issues in terms of putting in a pipeline, right? Or it's unstable in terms of taking the gas out of the ground, right? So there are a lot of unstable emerging market countries that fall in that category. If you look at LNG, how it's developed in the US, Cheniere is one company that's kind of led that charge over the last 10 years. And, they originally were building that capacity to supply Asia, which was a very high priced market. But if you look at their shipments over the last 10 years, a lot of that's gone to South America because even though there's a lot of gas in countries like Bolivia, the political dysfunction there, they can't move the gas around from one country to the other. And it's not the geography, it's just political barriers. So we've been shipping LNG from the Gulf Coast down to the Andean coast, which obviously is not the most economic trade to do. And the same for Mexico, with all the problems there that they have in the northern part of the country. They've got gas in the Burgos Basin, and I think it's logical that a lot of the gas shale plays that we have in South Texas extend over the border. So there's probably even more gas than they know. They can't develop that because it's an unstable region. So we've been supplying gas to LNG to the west coast of Mexico for their LNG project. So there's a lot of dysfunction, but it's more on the emerging market side.
Okay. But you wouldn't disagree with me when I said that, when I would say that energy, including exporting energy, is an American strength. And as far as a free trade, if it makes sense, we shouldn't be not exporting energy. You wouldn't say that, would you?
No, I fully believe in free trade. So, we have gas here. There are a lot of countries that don't have gas who should be importing it. So we should be servicing those markets, right? And there's obviously a lot of industrial countries in Asia, particularly North Asia, that don't have any indigenous resources, right? So yeah, I mean, we should take advantage of the resources we're giving, but we should help third world countries that have those reserves, right,
I
to
got you.
develop them and hopefully consume them domestically or at least regionally. And in order to do that, we have to develop the local economy as opposed to just taking their resources and shipping them elsewhere.
Well, in doing that, wouldn't that help? That goes back to give a man a fish or teach them how to fish, right? And if we can develop these local economies and allow them to develop their own local resources, ultimately, isn't that a better way of helping countries than to say, here, buy this very expensive renewable tech or things that have intermittency issues, as you've talked about?
Yeah, no, I mean, the worst thing you could do is have your economy dependent on intermittent power or energy sources. So we're doing a disservice, I think, to a lot of developing countries. And the climate change ideology, even though a lot of developing countries are not buying into this, there are a lot of really impoverished, poor countries, particularly in Africa, where this message is being told to them. A lot of the development banks, including the World Bank, no longer lend to oil and gas and fossil fuels, right? So they are pushing a lot of these renewable technologies on impoverished countries, which is the exactly wrong thing to do. And that needs to change, right? And that's unfortunate. And a lot of what's going on in the development banking world is now seeping into the commercial banking sector. And you're seeing a lot of bans in terms of lending to oil and gas.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And the IEA, which was set up by really first world developed countries to keep markets appraised of energy usage over time, even it hasn't been immune from criticism recently. I don't know if you've seen a couple Wall Street Journal articles or others, but they pulled their world energy outlook details down as they are now recalibrating. Because the narrative right now is out past 2050, hydrocarbons aren't going anywhere, and that's an inconvenient position for some. And so I don't know if you're following this from a Wall Street perspective, but there's been some criticism about where did the data go? Why are you hiding it? And they're saying we're not hiding it. We're just reformulating our analyses to take into account renewables. That's causing a lot of concern for quite a few analysts. Is that something you've tracked by chance?
Yeah, actually it's been shocking to me what's happened to the IEA over the last several years because it's been completely captured by the climate cult, if you will. The same for the United Nations. I mean, obviously the UN is what leads this annual conference of the parties. They lead the research from when it comes to climate change. And the IEA, even though it was founded 50 years ago to promote energy security in the developed world, is now doing the exact opposite because they are basically saying industrialized countries need to get off of fossil fuels, stop investing in it starting next year in order to achieve these climate emissions targets, and you need to transition to renewables. So, they're just basically as bad a propaganda marketing arm as the United Nations is right now. And, I think they give validity to the argument, and that's the danger around the IEA, because they have been viewed as kind of the energy expert around these matters. And the stuff that they put out is being used to drive regulations in Europe and over here, because everyone will reference, oh, the IEA says that we have to stop investing in fossil fuels beginning in 2025 if we want to achieve our climate goals. And so I fully expect in 2025, the regulatory attack on oil and gas is going to get much more aggressive. And certainly if Biden wins the second election.
Yeah, and what I find interesting in that regard is if you look in a few footnotes of the IEA stuff here and there, you'll see the unbiased version, which is we cannot stop investing in current energy sources until after the transition, which is the right answer. You don't ramp down before something else is ramped up. But yet, to your point, they've been quoted as saying, and they've talked about saying, and policymakers have have referenced the IEA to say we have to stop, and they're not pushing back on any of that, which was again a piece of that Wall Street Journal article, and because it doesn't fit the narrative. So where do you go for unvarnished information on world energy outlooks and usages, if not the IEA?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge problem. And if you look at what they say, it's not just good enough to invest in new technologies, right? New clean energy technologies. And over the last 2 years, the amount of capital going towards clean energy has surpassed what's been going into fossil fuels. Part of that is because fossil fuels are a much more efficient source of energy, and it requires less capital these days to generate, a larger unit of production, right? But that's not good enough, right? The fact that we're spending more on what they want, we need to start further cutting back on investment in fossil fuels, because the goal is to drive down supply. And you see that at the national level with a lot of regulations that are going after the demand side, going after internal combustion vehicles, natural gas infrastructure. For the last 5 to 6 years, we can't build pipelines in this country across blue states. It's all part of the same constricting movement around fossil fuels. So people may say, in the industry will take, I think, somewhat of a cynical approach by saying we're going to have to use fossil fuels for decades. That doesn't mean there's going to be a lot of economic damage if the other side continues to pursue their agenda.
Okay. And that's really what we're talking about here. And that brings me back to the definition of energy security, which we talked about a little bit earlier. I've noticed a troubling trend where there's a fourth parameter being placed onto the definition, and it's acceptability. Have you seen that as well? And obviously, I think that's quite dangerous to say, okay, affordability, reliability, availability, check, check, check. Oh, acceptability.
Yeah, I think that's consistent with kind of the ESG approach, at least trying to co-opt people working in the financial industry and at companies. Again, the goal is to remove your agency, right? Whether you're running a company or you're an investor, right? And with ESG, you have this chaotic system of priorities, starting with climate change, but they're non-financial, and you're always forced to go and get a third opinion about what's more important, right? So it's meant to basically look to someone outside of either the markets or your company about what to do. So that acceptability, again, it's moral acceptability, I think, is probably the long form of that.
Yeah.
But you have to get someone else's approval, right? It's no longer just an economic or a geopolitical decision, which is straightforward. Now it's acceptability. And then again, who makes that decision? Are we going to ask third world countries to sign off on whether we should have national security in the US? Again, it's kind of crazy when you think through it.
Do you think this level of the playing field is some sort of attempt to raise other countries up to our standards or to promote other countries at our expense?
Yeah, I think it's a wealth transfer, clearly.
Okay.
And what you may, it's probably the second iteration of globalization, right? So we've been moving a lot of industry from developed countries to developing countries, particularly China and India over the last couple of decades, right? Certainly since China joined the WTO about 20 years ago. So I think that obviously has leveled the playing field. And I think ESG will do the same because they're going to be allowed, the countries that are not constrained in terms of getting capital and making decisions are free to continue to use fossil fuels, particularly if it's indigenous, and that'll drive, their living standards higher, and if we follow the same path we're on right now, we're going to lower them and develop. So it will lead to a transfer of wealth effectively, and a leveling of the playing field. But again, if you take it to its logical conclusion, it's going to kill consumption in the largest markets in the world, and there'll eventually be a feedback mechanism to the third world.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on should China even be in the WTO? And I say this against the backdrop of China has filed a WTO tariff protest against the United States, saying that we are keeping Chinese EVs out of the country and that's unfair competition.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's an adversary politically, economically. I think we need to acknowledge that it is a communist country, no matter what the external trappings of capitalism are. And so, no, I would disagree with the admission to the WTO. Clearly, they were not qualified in terms of the freedom of the economy, right? And you can see the real world impact of that if you look at the U.S. and our electricity demand over the last 20 years. You can see that it's started to flatline and really not grow. And a lot of that, I think, is because we've been offshoring a lot of industry and manufacturing to China and other countries since that's happened. And China obviously is doing its own outsourcing to even cheaper countries in South Asia. So that's kind of the second iteration of that trade. So no, I think that's been negative. And you see in the last few years, all of the supply chain issues that we have. I mean, we're dependent on China and India for pharmaceuticals, chips now with Taiwan, depending on what happens there militarily. So and I think it would be insane for us to be dependent on China for electric vehicles, right? Again, we have no problem building more than enough electric vehicles for the demand here, which is not that great. So why we need to import electric vehicles, I don't know. So yeah, so I think we need to be more conscious about our economic dependency, and the entire green energy movement has a lot of inconsistencies there, because to make electric vehicles, you have to get, the minerals mostly in China, right? So you're dependent there in terms of your feedstock, right? Solar panels, go down the whole list, right? So we're placing our economy in further jeopardy, right? And we saw how badly that went during the pandemic.
Yeah, speaking of EVs, through the age of early adoption, the numbers looked initially pretty good because people who wanted EVs started buying EVs. Again, there are different adoption phases of technology, which you're probably well familiar with from your days. And, we've seen the EV sales now flatline. Inventory of EVs is 3 times what piston engine cars are now, gasoline-powered cars. Yet the government has come out with this new tailpipe emission standard, which effectively forces the retirement of the internal combustion engine because of the high bar for limiting emissions, and forces EVs upon Americans that so far are not willing to buy them. To me, this sort of seems like the very converse of a free market economy. How do we gel the government mandating not only a goal into the future, but to tell you how you're going to meet that goal and what private companies are going to be able to produce moving forward?
It's any way to reconcile or gel those regulations. So, I mean, the first order has to be when you get a change in administration in the White House to reverse a lot of these regulations, because as you say, they are anti-capitalistic. They restrict choice no matter what spin they put on it. and a lot of them can't be accomplished. So they're going to have a lot of negative unintended consequences. But if you look at EVs in the US up until now, I think the uptake has been something like 8% of registrations last year. These are mostly high-end electric vehicles, right? So probably out of reach for the average American, and they've been heavily subsidized, right? So you're
Right.
giving subsidies at both the state and federal level to higher income earners who don't need it. And they're using that as probably their second or their third car. And they probably live in a blue city or a blue city suburb, right? And they don't have to worry about, losing a charge, right? Or driving too far because it's a local commuting car, right? But in order for this to have this expansion across the country, you're going to need to solve all these logistical issues. You're going to need to build a lot more charging stations. We're going to have to see exactly how long these batteries last during hot and cold weather. And you're going to need to bring the price point down, right? A lot to accomplish in the next, 5 to 7 years. But the federal government through the EPA has already mandated that you need to stop over the next few years making internal combustion engines, because that's the only way you're going to be able to hit your tailpipe restriction.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a bit disingenuous, isn't it, to call it a tailpipe emission versus a mandatory ban on the internal combustion engine. And to your point, yeah, I walk around large cities, as I expect you do. Take Manhattan or somewhere, and I look at most people, if they can afford to park anywhere, they're on the street. The charging infrastructure is not complete. Others say, "Oh, don't worry. If you build it, they will come." Remember that movie. Why does that not work? And why are we making a terrible mistake when it comes to these centralized government mandates? Aside from it being anti-capitalist and really anti-innovation.
We point out the obvious that this is basically central government planning. It has the appearance of working through the private sector, but that's kind of ESG and climate in a nutshell. So the government is going to have to solve for that, because no one in the private sector, I think, rationally is going to step up and risk their capital to build, the required network of charging stations around the country, right? So and until you do that, people are not going to be more comfortable driving a car. I mean, that's kind of probably the main discriminative factor right now, is that I don't have to worry. I mean, every time you go out in your car and drive around, you're going to have to worry. It requires a lot of planning to figure out where all the charging stations are now, and that'll probably be the case for several years. And no one's really had to gone through that since the 1920s, when we were first moving to gas powered, vehicles, right? So it makes life a lot more complicated, just like all the recycling laws that we have now around plastic bags. Being in New Jersey, I will tell you, they're completely convoluted, and they are working to counter purpose, right? They're actually creating more plastic waste that has to go into the landfill because none of these new bags are recyclable. So, I mean, it's going to require the government to solve that. I think a lot of those issues are unsolvable. Actually, you saw that with ethanol 15 years ago. Again, this was under the Bush administration, and they put out the mandates about renewable fuels, and they mandated that we have to start producing X amount of ethanol, including cellulosic ethanol, which didn't exist at the
Didn't
time.
exist. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and it's like, people have to do this, right? And so that, I think it's like the same problem. The government is just like directing the economy to do this, and I don't think the private sector is going to risk their capital to do it. So they're going to have to figure that out. Will they back away from the mandate? Unclear, again. Or maybe they just are happy with people's existing fossil fuel cars slowly aging out of existence, right? And then it will be a luxury to have an electric vehicle, and that will give you more control over the population, right? Only the proper people at the higher income level will have the luxury of being able to drive going forward, which is not crazy.
Well, that seems contrary, though, to some of those politicians who are politicians of the people, for the common man, for the seems the exact opposite of that, isn't it?
Yeah, when I say that's not crazy, it is crazy objectively. It's not crazy to think that that's how the other
Yeah.
side is thinking, just to make that clear. But I think a lot of progressive goals and policies have been played or laid out as being good for everyone, right? I mean, Democrats have always had the biggest hearts, right? And they're trying to do good. They always keep screwing up for some reason. So there's an issue with the size of their brain, but their hearts are very big, and we have to give them the benefit of the doubt. I think we need to dispel ourselves of that notion going forward. I think there's knowledge on the other side that this is going to go badly, and it's going to be constricting for Americans and the economy, and that is the end goal. And I think we need to use tactics to reverse it accordingly.
Okay. Well, I've really appreciated this conversation today, but before we get out of here, how does somebody get a hold of your book?
You can get it through the publisher Encounter Books on their website or any major book retailer, including Amazon.
Great. Well, Paul, thanks so much for your time today. I've really appreciated it. I've learned something from our conversation, and I wish you the best.
Thanks, Brigham. I appreciate it.